Morning all. As kindly introduced, Paul Heywood, I lead the data and analytics function at Equifax. And I've, ahead of the glamorous AI slots, I've kindly been invited along to talk a little bit about what we're seeing and some of my views around the economic impact on consumers, financial services, but obviously within the collection space. So I should caveat that, the standard caveat you always hear at these things, that I'm not an economist, but like everybody, it plays a big part, personal life, professional life, and I keep a close eye on it both through our data, plus through what's coming out through the markets and the regulator. So I've got a few quick slides at the top where I'm going to do the kind of macro view. I'll move pretty quickly through those, and then I'll jump into a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of consumers and consumers' performance. So let's start with Mrs. Reeves, Rachel Reeves. Cast your mind back to last summer, new government in. That government was pretty quick to repeat heavily the 40 billion tax gap that they'd inherited from a Tory government. Consumer confidence was growing, new government in, there was some enthusiasm in the market. And then roll forward to the autumn budget, which I think is October, if I've got my dates right, and Rachel delivers her first brown suitcase delivery to Britain. And she described it as the Rebuild Britain budget. And what that really meant was bridging the gap to that 40 billion and moving us into a position of growth going forwards. So 40 billion's got to be paid for. That we knew would come with tax implications, considerations for consumers, disposable income, etc. But who was it impacting? The reality is, it's kind of everybody, as we'd expect. The graph here has kind of got your less affluent on the left, or less highly paid, I should say, could be very affluent and not on a high salary, through to the wealthier cohorts or quintiles on the right-hand side. And really what it boiled down to was every household, or I should say every working adult in every household was going to have to contribute somewhere between £200 and £1,000 a year to help bridge this gap. And it's fair to say, kind of at the left-hand side, whilst the bars are shorter, i.e. the value's less, the impact probably is a little bit heavier versus on the right-hand side. But listen, it's not doomsday. It's all somewhere below 1%. So there's a give there, but it wasn't the tidal wave, I think, that maybe some made out in the press. And then Rachel also came up with another set of policies that if you dug deep into the budget, you might have seen more relevant to our industry. There was some pieces in there around areas like central government bodies, DWP, getting greater access to data, in effect having an ability to go into our current accounts, have a look at where the benefits are being paid into appropriately, mitigate fraud, error, those types of activities. She also spoke to, this agenda of trying to power the growth agenda with more data and more access to data. For those that haven't seen it, there's an existing scheme out there called the CCDS, Commercial Credit Data Sharing. There's some thresholds about when you've got to provide, when you haven't. That's gonna be removed so that there's more insight, effectively kind of business turnover, pseudo P&L stuff. There's more insight on all the organisations in the country. Mortgage market stagnated a little bit. Okay, so let's back this 95% LTV. It's essentially the government saying that they will secure lending at what's a high LTV rate and typically by the banks considered very high risk. It isn't, in my mind, but that's a different conversation. There's other pieces in there that if you dig deeper, including a nod to the income minimum wage coming in April. So what does that really mean? What does it mean to our beloved Barbara behind the bar or the student that's fresh out of uni? The reality is that the increase in minimum wage, I think it's about 80p without looking at the screen behind me, means that we've now got this sort of 25k benchmark, which, you know, I'll be careful making comment in the fortunate position that most of us in the room are, but that's a punchy kind of minimum level versus where we were maybe 15 years ago as a percentage of average. So everybody who's working on a full-time basis has got access to those sorts of salary levels. And typically, a graduate coming out of uni, day one, well, they can expect on average to achieve something like 25k as well. So in reality, you know, both your person behind the bar, or always dangerous quoting a job against one end of the scale, but you know, anybody in permanent employment or a student have got this solid baseline, and in fact, it's probably the student that, when you consider every penny they earn over 25k is also subject to student loan kind of repayment, would have a whopping 37% kind of equivalent tax rate versus somebody that's got a 20% wage insurance plus around 8% NIC contribution. But effectively, if you're working, things aren't that bad. You know, there's been a pro-work government stance for a long time, and you can see the move to kind of bridge the gap between the national average salary, which is about 36k, and these minimum wage standards, whether you're in the 18 to 21 category or 21 above, where there's a slightly higher rate. You're doing okay in some guys. The problem is if you fall out of work. You know, we've got a completely opposite trajectory here in terms of what's happening from people that might be in greater financial difficulty. I appreciate it's a long time frame, we're, you know, all the way back to 70s here, but this is something like a 50% reduction when you consider what the unemployment benefit wage is as a percentage of an ever-growing average national salary. And it actually doesn't matter whether you're unemployed because you've retired or you're unemployed because you're not working. These kind of divergence of lines still continue. If you aspirationally, I think the figures that get quoted by pension advisors is 40 to 50% of your salary is a kind of minimum level that you want to be taking to your retirement. So, you know, you may be half of the way through that with a state pension, and your unemployment piece is really not giving you the quality of life that you might expect. So you've got this, I think it was on the previous slide, you've got 26% increase in kind of minimum wage over just over a decade. You've got pretty flat average wage in the country. It's grown about 2%. It dropped in post the financial crisis in 2008. Came back a little bit, has struggled and stalled a bit with inflation, pandemic, cost of living crisis, etc. And almost this norm towards 25k for a lot of people. So I'll come back to that just in terms of consumer resiliency. Again, I'm not an economist, but I take all of that and say, it just says there's a bit of volatility in the market for me. It feels as if we're on the precipice of some changing consumer circumstances that haven't bitten. There's large cohorts of the UK population that are you know, protected via some of these means and these minimum wage levels, but there's also another demographic that are being further, marginalised is the wrong word, but you know, sitting in a more differentiated financial state than the rest of the UK, which is benefiting from some of those growth trends. So before I move on into, you know, some of what I see in our data, just some other bits that are happening relative to our sector or sectors. Most people probably have heard of the FCA's Credit Information Market Study. SIMS. Some people call it KIMS. It's not. It can't be KIMS. Surely it's SIMS. The aim of this study really is to look at how the market's operating. It's aimed at ensuring that it can be a competitive market, that there's no barriers to entry, all the regulators' sort of key guidelines. And they've been undertaking that research since the back end of 23. No doubt people in the room have had to supply data into it. We've certainly had to supply a lot within Equifax. And they're focused on a few areas. There's a few key things they've come out and observed. The first one is that the data landscape is inconsistent. So you may have differing data partners in this room that kind of support the services that you provide. Paul Heywood looks different in each of the three CRAs. The regulator doesn't like that from a consistent outcomes perspective, from a explainability to the consumer perspective. So they've drawn up plans to standardize the way data is reported. It's called SURF, which is a standard industry reporting format, and everybody is going to move to this new common standard, which means the CRAs, of which there's 3 or 4 currently, depending on how you cut it, all will have access to an equivalent format supplied consistently that will help in some of the disputes areas and some of the interpretation of that data. They will also push, even though they're not saying it in a hard line in bullets 1 to 3, for that to be mandated. So drive the consistent data share agenda in order that consumers are represented equally across the bureaus. I think they will stagger that. I don't think it'll be a big bang because the burden on some organisations to share data will mean that they'll probably tread carefully. And then the second one is, I work in the CRA sector, and I'm the first to hold my hand up and say managing disputes and data issues for consumers with CRAs is a blooming nightmare. To have to speak to 3 organisations, 2 of which might have my data and 1 that might, and carry out some sort of update or notice of correction or those type of activities, it's 70s at best, and certainly not 2025. So they want to tackle that problem. Not an easy one to solve. There's talk of maybe a centralised hub where data comes in and then is pushed out to the CRAs in order that you can manage it one time. But we'll have to see the direction that goes. I'm interested whether private organisations go for that hub, whether the regulator comes up with a different approach. And then the last one is a bit on consumer education. We're not the US. People don't know their FICO score. Consumers are confused by what a credit score. They're not even the same range. So it's 700 on one bureau, 1,000 on another. So there'll be work done around ensuring consumers better understand and interact with their statutory credit report, but also the products and services that CRAs supply into our clients, including people around the room. The last one to mention, and I'll be quick on it because I get it's less relevant, more relevant to some, is the whole governing body that oversees the reciprocity of data in the UK is called SCORE. SCORE will likely, anybody from SCORE, before I say the next sentence? SCORE, thank you. SCORE and you see him change his words slightly? SCORE and the CRGB will be looking at how that reciprocity is governed going forward in line with the recommendations coming out, the remediation plans coming out of the FCA. So the IWG, or Independent Working Group, has got representation from multiple parties on it, including the CRAs. They're looking to define what that new overarching governance structure looks like. 2 more quick ones. It's 1 more quick one. I thought the Ofgem piece was interesting, particularly when we get to mortgages and how important rent is in the UK. For many it's the biggest committed expenditure that people have got. You're seeing this pro-consumer, which we're all supportive of, agenda coming out across the regulators. So it's not just the FCA. Good consumer outcomes. Ofgem's looking at a significant increase in utility arrears. The figure I read, there'll be experts in the room, the figure I read was that 90% increase had taken it to over 3 billion. So a provision by the regulator to support around half a billion to a billion. If I said 3 million before, I meant 3 billion. Half a billion to a billion write-off in that sector for arrears that were accrued during the pandemic. Also, Ofgem driving, more engagement with consumers in financial difficulty, better billing, less ability for consumers to get into arrears in the first place. So I talk to numbers that are typically just over half the market is owner-occupied, and of the half that isn't, about half that market is in either social, and the other half is in private rental. So it's a big chunk of your kind of 55 million UK adult population. So, all that said, how are people feeling? What's the sense in the polls and public on the street? Maybe I should stand out of the way a little bit. Well, as we came out of the pandemic and started to go into the cost of living crisis, you could see that there was this real spike. Up to 70% of people with a bit of a doomsday view, negative. Things are getting worse. I'm struggling. And we had this sort of very low 16% of people that were in a positive mind state. Then came along I'll jump to that one in a second. So you see that declining here, and then, he says, clunkily, then came to the election point. So at the back end of 24, when the getting worse line is coming down, people are starting to go, okay, new government in, I can see the horizon, things are on the up, GDP's, well, we've got a bit of growth, we've got nearly 1% growth in the country, inflation, thank God's coming down because the mortgage rate's killing me, and yeah, maybe I've got a little bit more cash in my pocket. But what you can see now is, since the budget that happened at the back end of the year, consumers are concerned. This, it spiked right back up in terms of the interpretation in the market is that we're in a tough place. So when I look at all of that, and then I'm fortunate enough to be custodian of loads of data in the kind of bureau world, you sort of expect that people are feeling that pinch, that that's starting to play through in terms of the way people are managing their accounts. And the story over the next few slides is largely that consumers are adapting. So if I start with what does repayment look like, just in terms of, are people staying up to date or are they falling into arrears? Please remember this is a percentage change graph, so it's not an arrears rate graph, it's just versus the prior December position, have arrears rates improved or gone the other way? And what you see is in 23, probably when the cost of living crisis was biting hardest, that's when we had a lot of people coming off of fixed-term mortgages. They might have borrowed at sub 2% 4 years ago. They're coming straight into a market that's offering them at 4.5%. We did see an uptick. The mortgage figure is a bit of a misnomer, and it's just that mortgage arrears rates are so low, 1%, sub 1%, that any little variation in there means that you end up with a big orange bar. But that storm, to some extent, appears to have been weathered. This isn't necessarily an improvement across the board, but it's flattened. People aren't getting. There's not a higher rate of arrears being seen in the market, and indeed in some areas it's improving. I think auto has had a tough time. Auto still continues to roll a little bit the other way. And then for people that are in collections, so this is arrears cases, and are they curing from one, or are they rolling to a worse status? No real shift. People are entering collections. There was a bit of a peak, but it's not getting worse. People that are in collections aren't struggling further. And if anything, in 24, what we've seen is that those delinquency roll rates have improved. So we're seeing less people roll on. I think there's a bit of There is a bit of regulation in this. The business that's been written way back here to the left of the graph, Consumer Handbook came in, CONC from the regulator, more affordability levels checking came in. So I think that has helped with some of the exposure versus when you remember '08, as soon as it bit in '08, everything went off a cliff straight away. We've not seen that. Consumers are more able to manage it. But I do also think that consumers are managing their affordability challenge rather than this just being an easy one to take on the chin. It's the fact that people are prioritising debt and the fact that people recognise the implications it has on their life, that they're prepared to make sacrifices elsewhere. The average mortgage in the UK today is £860-something. So 221, I've got it down here, 221 is a really significant increase. If I was paying 620 and I'm now paying 840, I've got to make lifestyle changes to accommodate that. And where there's an opportunity people have, when the forbearance routes came out, it's not a massive number, is it? 148k. I think some of that's about awareness. But people went in and said, I need to lean on these schemes, you know, the fact that I can flip for 6 months onto an interest only and I can carve out 400 of that 600 for 6 months to give me braking pace into the following year was something that people looked at. 14% of mortgages with a term over 35 years, that was 3.5% in 2022. So, you know, people are refinancing, they're extending. The banks are more open to it. I did it. I hold my hand up. I bought just as the kind of cost of living really bid in. I got lucky on my APR and got in just before the window, but I was nervous. And as soon as the regulator kind of opened this up with Barclays, I was up and I stuck 4 years on just to ease that payment. So I think consumers are adapting. And then we have data from current accounts as well that shows sort of more of the transactional level data, and we aggregate that and we create insights out of it, and we can see the change in behaviour within that data, all of it facilitating this kind of macro pressure, increasing base rate ahead of inflation coming down, and people, you know, it's very clear. Waitrose spend is down, Aldi spend is up. Those things are all evident. So I guess there is a bit of macro pressure. It's not at the extent where it is quashing consumers' ability to exist. It is forcing consumers to make different lifestyle choices. As a result of those lifestyle choices, they're managing to maintain their financial commitments. And the question for me becomes really about the sustainability of that and managing that pressure. So there's nervousness. This is quick, I won't stay on this, it's not particularly sexy. But mortgage rates are still flat. People aren't putting their foot into that market at the moment. They want to wait and see. There is a nervousness. But utilisation's going up. And it's going up at a faster rate than the average salary. So there's an indebtedness of some description happening there when salaries are below the growth rate. It's 4.5%, but if you look, this line looks more than 4.5%. It's 100 is the baseline in July 21. We're up at 25% growth. The reason is that if this was extended here, there was a big drop after pandemic. So pandemic levels were actually only 5% lower than where we are today. We've now got past the pandemic levels. So for a long time, I was doing a few of these presentations throughout COVID, and we kept using this language of consumers had built up a contingency, a resiliency. You know, we saw all the balances come down, we saw revolving debt paid off, and we kept saying that people are leaning on that contingency to manage themselves through the early parts of the cost of living. This sort of suggests that people have now had to go back to their revolving products. They've used that headway that they had, and so when I go back to the previous slides in terms of performance, I don't see this stopping particularly quickly as long as the the cost side of it stays high. So it's at what point, and if, I hope it doesn't, but at what point does that then start to materialise in performance? The quick one on buy now, pay later, just because it is so topical, get asked about it a lot. Buy now, pay later is clearly a tool, a payment tool that people are using. This is saying sort of 1 in 4 people are using it reasonably regularly. For me, as one voice in the room, it hasn't got to where I thought it might do a couple of years ago. Look, £66 a month average we're using it, just to be clear, isn't a nominal figure. But when you've got APR impacts putting £220 on a £620 mortgage versus a buy now, pay later agreement, which tend to be, there's different groups, there's people that are consistent users, but there's a lot of people that are one-time purchasers on it, so it's not, £600-700 in a year. So we'll see. There's been consolidation in that market, but my view on buy now, pay later, it probably differs a lot from where it was perhaps 2 years ago. So what does it look like ahead? Consumers, I repeat myself, but we're in an okay place. Consumers are managing, and that's very generalistic. I recognise there'll be people that have got challenges. The things I think about going forward, relevant to, I hope relevant to people in the room, are this pro-consumer agenda that's across all the regulators, and obviously fantastic. The consumer duty driving the way some of our businesses need to operate. We've put a lot of time into the first annual report that's gone into the regulator. Phil mentioned responsible AI, the ability to be able to ensure that products and offerings and treatment of customers is fit for that individual. That stuff is going to have a real bearing on maybe the third column there, which is the industrial fines. If you look across, what was TSB 10 million, HSBC 7 million, Volkswagen 6 million, all of those, to a letter, were down to treatment of consumer. So you've got this regulator trying to change the culture, driving much more visibility and accountability. Every board's got to have a designated consumer duty champion. Every executive committee should be getting regular readouts in terms of progress against consumer duty, and then annual reports in. And I think the regulator looked at about 138 companies based on the first round of submissions. So I see that as a big piece. PS24, I guess another FCA drive to really focus in on the people in fin difficulty, so potentially more aligned to those people that are unemployed. Lots of language coming out in that consultation, which I think closed in February, but will be followed up with some regulatory guidance. Treating people in financial difficulty the way that we're treating everybody else in the pot isn't going to wash it going forward. And I've mentioned the industry fines. And the other one that I popped on, maybe a little bit tenuously, was just claims management companies. I think there's a dynamic there for me that I can see evolving, whereby claims management companies representing consumers that have maybe not been treated fairly in whatever the latest motor, cards, credit limit scandal is something I hear more and more about. And claims management companies being able to access data on behalf of the consumer through the consumer's consent is one that we need to think about as a CRA. Clearly, we monetize the insights and services that we put on top of that data. You have a change in market whereby consumers are more empowered to request access for the data. That's one that's... I know the IWG is also looking at it in terms of what the recommendations should be out of that, but it needs formalizing, it needs standardizing. So a couple of, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, a couple of closing pieces from me. All that said, there is a move to be pro-growth. In some quarters, there's a sense that the regulation has stifled the growth. Equally, if you read The Guardian, they'll say just loosening regulation doesn't encourage growth for many reasons that we can probably think about. But there is a focus on enabling the industry, the sector, to return to growth and not feel ham-shackled by shackles, I think is the term. So two more things. I'm focused on renters a little bit, and maybe you can pick it up in terms of the flow of the slide. But the renters bill as well, I think, is an important one. It's a sector that haven't had a great experience in prior years. It is a huge commitment. It does cause huge distress. So some of the guidelines that are coming out of the renters bill, further empowering consumers in that conversation, the idea of a central rental exchange in order that, yes, both renters are better protected in terms of a view of their agreement and deposits and all the things that go along with that, but also an ability to extend to consumers who have a big rental commitment that isn't seen necessarily by the industry, I think is a really positive one. And I've got to do a double click now because I duped a slide, so blink. Never saw anything. And then it would be remiss, I think. Was I going to use the Trump word, wasn't I? I didn't know. I thought, well, let's just share a couple of thoughts on it. So there is this national insurance. What does it mean? Is Santander pulling out of Canary Wharf? I don't know. But there's definitely a sense that some large corporations are looking at the UK and saying, is that, the right growth area trajectory for us? We don't know where that'll land. Thus, some of the government's pro-growth agenda ease the regulation so that the Santander board can sit down and say, no, actually our numbers stack up. You've got that whole piece. And then you've got this emerging, you'll know as much as I do, so I'm not going to preach to the converted, this emerging trend of trade war happening. What could the implications of that be? It's certainly historically been a global growth slower when there's a trade war taking place. So I sort of just wanted to mention it at the end because we go through the top part of the journey and say, listen, there's pressure, consumers are adapting, there's a 0.2 shift % in auto recovery rates, and that actually, I'm a father of 2 daughters. The thing that I really think about is the big rock stuff in this. I think whilst consumers have got a government that supports them and a mature industry that's regulated well, yes, there'll be bumps, but by and large, we've got through a pandemic, we've got through a cost of living crisis. Hats off to us, really. The parts that are less in our control are, geographical instability, political tariffing, and those sorts of things are the ones that, over the next 12, 18 months, I use the word precipice at the top of the slot. They're the ones that I think we've got to keep an eye on because they're the ones that could really change this language of employed, not employed, sort of doing okay, probably struggling. You bring any of those big pieces in and the whole market shifts a little. But not to end on a humdrum before all things sexy and AI, listen, the message is still the same, that people, far more than when I joined the industry maybe 23, 24 years ago, people understand the implications of debt. People understand the importance of getting financial matters back on track. And it's playing through in the data. Even when all the other data I can see is squashing their disposable, they are maintaining a need to honour those commitments. So the onus on us as an industry, I think, is to help those people with the options and help them manage through that recoveries process in order that, they're not further tying themselves into insolvency type conversations because they're overreaching. I don't know how I'm doing for time on questions. We're about wrap, are we? So I'm about all day, lucky enough to be invited along. If I can answer anything, please feel free to give me a shout. Otherwise, appreciate the slot, and thanks for sticking with me on the economy side of today's kind of gig. Thanks a lot, all.
I'll do 2 quick ones if you don't mind.
Yeah, is that all right? Well, I've got to... Yeah, no, good. I'll grab 2 quick questions, and then there's not so much pressure to answer them all as you're going away. So, working in the commercial collection space, How do you think the national insurance rises will impact small businesses? Oh, as if by magic. Get off my phone now.
I honestly, so firstly, I am a bit biased towards consumer in my day job, but I believe that the impact is more related to the services and products that they offer and the P part of their P&L. You know, if their growth agenda can be supported because the market remains buoyant, actually a smaller organisation on a national insurance contribution might have a bit of flex. The problem comes where those growth targets are being stretched because the market's still a bit stagnant. Then you've got a compounding thing that my top line and my bottom line is being hit at the same time. I don't have the capital reserves to run long term. So that initiative around CCDS and sharing a view of turnover running through commercial entities, I think could be a really powerful agent in assisting in commercial collections. You know, understanding, are they stable? Have they got continuity of revenues? Or actually they're flatlining or decreasing and they're about to be hit by another OPEX.
Cool. And then a really quick one, because it's the most popular question now. Is the cost of living crisis actually over?
It's not over, in my mind. It's not over until that inflation rate needs to hit the bottom. We need to see the brakes because the mortgage market stimulates lots. There's a downstream impacts from the mortgage market slowing. If you can get your housing market moving, which is why there's 95% moves, if you can give people confidence to tie in on a secured lending, that gives them the confidence to spend on the high street and retail. So for me, it's not over until we see the kind of sub-2, and probably it would be nice to see GDP at least for 3 consecutives in a positive place, just so we knew there wasn't a looming little shallow recession there somewhere.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
I'll get a copy of these questions and we'll try and get some answers later.
Lovely.
Thanks very much. Round of applause for Paul, please.